morning, everyone, and welcome to our Module 4, Chapter 10 demonstration slash walkthrough. So what you guys have been learning in the module this week is about GIS and cartography and basic cartographic principles, which are basically the rules you follow when making maps effectively. So when you make a map, it's not just having data that shows what you're representing. You actually want to visualize that data in a way that makes sense to people. So what we're going to do today is look at some maps and see whether or not those are effectively representing what they need the audience to know. So as you can see on the screen that's open, I'm obviously on USGS maps, so we're going to start there. But the reason we're going to do this is for your Chapter 5 Presenting GIS Data Lab, the entirety of your chapter review questions essentially have you find a map of your choosing, so you just have to pick one. And then it makes you go through some listings on and answer some questions about how you feel about the map, the basic objective of the map as you see it, and limitations or things you would change. So I'm actually going to walk through a couple of those with you today, and then that way you guys have a better idea of what you guys should be answering when you guys do your labs. So I'm actually going to go to the U.S. earthquake ones because those tend to be pretty helpful, and we're going to go through a couple of these because sometimes different maps have different information, and that's really important to consider when you guys are actually choosing your map as well. So one of the first ones we're going to do is a very simple looking map. And we're actually going to visit the page because that way we might actually get some more information on it. So we'll go back to this first. So just looking at this map, there's no title for one, so it might be hard for you guys to actually understand what this is. If you are just looking for images, which is what I'm doing, then sometimes this is something you very much need to be careful of in terms of doing a Google search. So I would definitely always visit the page that you're finding the map on, just in case it's not giving you enough information. So we're going to go ahead and go here. And obviously, as you can see, this is a lower 48 map and data off of the USGS site. And this map is from the USGS Earthquake Hazards Program. And so basically what this is showing, based on the description that you can find on the site, is, it's showing seismic hazard maps. And they do go through a description about what these maps show and things like that. And then it gives you a listing of the different types of things that you can get. This is where things get a little more complicated in terms of trying to figure out what it is you're looking at. So if you are unaware of USGS earthquake maps, what they do is they map ground shaking probability. So it's not necessarily the probability of an earthquake occurring, it's more the probability of how much the ground will shake. So that's what they mean by a PGA, which is the peak ground acceleration or the absolute worst ground acceleration you could have, versus different levels. And so we're going to go ahead and do this one, the 5 Hertz 2% chance in 50 years. So this is actually a much better version of the map than the one that we saw here. Looks very similar though, and that's because they're basically using the same type of measurement, but this is probably a much different probability. And so when I mean that, what I'm saying is at the bottom you can see that it says the 2% probability of exceedance in 50 years map of the 0.2 second spectral response acceleration. What that means is for every 50 years, if an earthquake had a 2% probability of exceeding a specific ground acceleration or massive amount of ground shaking, this is what it would be. So when you see 1.6 versus 0, that's basically telling you that if you had the 2% chance of this occurring in 50 years, the probability that it would exceed, say, I don't know, like here, 0.28% of ground acceleration, that means that these areas would never have a probability of getting a greater shake, but they do have the probability of having a ground acceleration percent of 0.28. So it's a little confusing, But if you had not found this information, the title or anything like that, and all you were looking at was this map, that could be incredibly frustrating or even not helpful because you guys don't really know what it is. So that's what I'm talking about when you guys are actually going to do a map critique. So I'm actually going to do a different map. So we're going to do a hazards map. And I do want images, and we're going to find one that actually has basic cartographic elements. So a title, a scale bar, maybe some information boxes that actually give you some information about what's going on in the map. And quite honestly, you've got a couple here that might be good, so I'm going to go ahead and open these. But one of the best types of maps that I've ever found to have a lot of additional information are actually National Geographic maps. So I'm going to go open these two, and then I'm going to type in National Geographic maps. Yay for spell check. So this one was cool. So we'll do this one. So I'm going to view image. And then I'm going to view image for this one. And then we're going to view image for that one. Okay, so we're not going to start with this one because it won't display. Okay. We'll try this one. Nope. The one thing that does suck about National Geographic is it is proprietary, so sometimes they don't let you look at their things without buying them. So while we let this load in a smaller setting, we'll go to this one. So we're going to go through the questions, and I've got them right here in front of me so we can kind of go through examples of what you guys' response should be like. And so first one is go online and find an example for each of the map purposes listed in the first section. And that is listed here in your lab book, not your textbook, so your lab book. So you guys should be able to go to the very front of that section, and you guys will have been gone over tools and things like that, but the thing that you want to look at is this page right here. It's page 140, and it is the purpose page. So whenever you look at a map, whenever you start to create a map, the first thing you should think about is the purpose of the map. So when you are creating a map, the first thing you should decide is what is the full purpose of what you are doing the map for. If you are ever looking at a map, the thing you should ask yourself immediately is, does this map serve its purpose? So I'm going to be flipping through a couple pages here just to make sure we're on the same page. Literally. Okay. So first one, go online and find an example of each of the map purposes. So for one, the first one is locating, and that one would show where a location of something is. So that would be like a reference map. So if we typed in a reference map and we went to images, these are all examples of a map whose purpose is location. It is actually telling you where something is. Most reference maps are considered location maps because that's what they're developed from. However, you could also do historical earthquake maps. And this should give you, if you spell it right, maps of where historical earthquakes have occurred. So these are all examples of location maps. And this is something that you might want to type in if you're actually doing that specific part of the question. So this one's pretty interesting too, and it's also a USGS map. So we're going to go back to the other page though. I'm going to bookmark it so I can flip back and forth very quickly. So basically, you find an example for each of these. Then what you do is you actually find another map. So it can be any type of one of those 5 types. So you have the locating, the navigating, the compiling, the convincing, and the comparing maps. What you do from basically 2 to 8 is you pick another map that matches one of those purposes, and then you answer some questions about it. So I actually kind of like this one that we're looking at. One of the first questions is to describe your initial impression of the map. So I work a lot with hazards data, and since I'm very familiar with hazards data, this map makes sense to me because I can tell that they're showing me where different epicenters of earthquakes have occurred, and then the different size symbols are telling me the different types of magnitude. I intuitively know that because I have seen this before, but the legend here does do a very good job of telling you that as well. And so my first impression of the map is it's obviously showing me about different types of earthquake hazards. I think that the colors are very pleasing, I can understand it, and I think it's doing a good job of telling me what it needs to. I think it's meeting its purpose. Now, one of the other questions, though, is state the map objective and explain how each layer does or does not support it. So this is where things can get a little complicated because some people don't need a lot of information about things to understand them, whereas other people might look at this map and just be like, I have no idea what I'm looking at. So in my opinion, there is something about this map that is frustrating to me just because it's not listed on the legend, and that's these little areas that are in yellow. Those probably, and I'm saying this because there's a name called Jacksonville right next to one of these little blobs, which I'm assuming is the boundary of a city. So these are probably all cities, but if that was not something you intuitively thought of when you looked at this map, you might be a little confused as to why there's all this random yellow. So I personally think that they should have added at least something in the legend that said yellow polygons are actual city boundaries. In terms of the other layers, I do indeed like how this layer specifically with all the different contour lines is actually transparent. So not only can you see where the different boundary lines for all the states are, you can also see the topography below it. Typically, earthquakes tend to occur where there are certain type of topographic features. And as you can see, if you follow the Appalachians essentially, they're along higher areas of earthquake activity. So it makes sense, and I like that they did it that way. So those are the types of things you would talk about with the layers in terms of what you did or didn't like. Another one is to critique the balance and alignment of the map. So one of the things that you guys should have gone over through this lab, or will go over through reading it, is whenever you develop a map, you basically want to use the space as efficiently as possible. So say that this paper is your map. If I were to show you a map like this, and the map literally covered this section, there would be all this white space, and it would make it look awful, because all you would be doing is effectively using half of the space you were given. So when we talk about balance and using negative space effectively, what we're saying is your data and the rest of the elements that go with your data should actually be arranged in a way that is pleasing to look at, because no one wants to look at a map they think is ugly. But that also means too that there needs to be a balance. So it's kind of like feng shui in your living room. You want things to balance out with each other. Same thing with a map. You want things to balance out so that your eyes follow things in a natural order, or at least one that makes sense to your brain. And you don't want there to be a lot of blank space. Like, you don't want to sit there and look at a blank space and just be like, why is this blank space here? And why didn't they move some aspect of this over here? So that's what we mean by actually critiquing the balance. And so for this map specifically, personally, I think they did a pretty decent job of making sure that the map is balanced. One of the big things is the data that you're actually presenting should actually be the largest thing on the map, which they successfully do because this is the main part of their map and it takes up most of the space. What I don't like is how they've kind of smushed the scale bar here at the bottom, even though there's not a whole lot of other places they could have put it, and I understand that. But then this space right here is actually kind of bothering me. I don't like that they actually put a frame around the legend, just because to me it kind of cuts off the flow of the map a little bit, but it's not so bad that I'm going to sit there and be like, oh my god, this is the worst map ever. Anytime you guys find a map, there will always be something that you don't like about it. And in this case, I'm being nitpicky, and I don't personally like this specific section. One of the other things I don't like, which may not be a result of the map itself, but it could be because of the Google search, which is why I'm going to go to visit page, is once again, there is no title on this map. So maybe when it comes up in the next page there will be, but for now there's not. And that means that unless you intuitively know what you are looking at, there's no way for you to know exactly what this map is showing you or what the purpose is. One of the easiest ways to tell people immediately what the purpose of the map is to have a title, an informative title. So here, even when we click on the map, there's still no title. However, they did try and change that by actually adding a caption essentially that tells you this is what the map is. So they kind of help out with that in terms of at least adding a caption saying this is what this is. But other than that, I think this is a pretty cool map. So now we're going to go back to the natural hazard rural map, which is not the best. This one's better. So this one's obviously not done through a US agency, but it is done through Munich RE. And obviously I just found these online. But this map is interesting because it definitely has a lot of the main data right here. But it also has 8 other maps that show you different anomalies. And so what those are called are the inset maps. So inset maps are not the main map that you're looking at. They are additional maps that could add other information or could show a different thing. One of the things you guys go over in the slides is the difference between an inset map and a locator map. So a locator map would be a map that was telling you this is where you're looking. So it'd be like me having a picture of Latah County, or a map of Latah County, and then having a little locator map that shows where Latah County is in Idaho. These are inset maps because they are actually looking at something else. So like this one, for example, looks at anomalies during El Nino, and it actually finds what types of weather conditions or cyclone activity they have during those types of weather events. And if you actually look down here at the legend, this is really informative. So they actually tell you what the earthquake zones are, and they actually give you a lot of information about what exactly that legend is telling you. So this is actually a pretty well done map. The only thing that might be hard for people to understand about it is the more information you have on a map, the more complicated it is. So if you're trying to hand things out to people that are just going to give it a glance and look away, this map is probably not the best because it involves so much detail. However, if you are looking for a very detailed hazards map for the global perspective, and you want all of this information, this is pretty well done and pretty well laid out. But once again, all of that goes back to what the purpose of the map is. So that's why that is so important. On top of that, you have to think about who the audience is. This is online, so the audience could essentially be anybody. However, most of the time maps are made with a very specific audience in mind. So just because they're on the internet doesn't mean that you have to make this like easy to read, has absolutely no language that people that don't work in that field can understand. You don't have to do that. You just have to be aware that because it's online, people who don't have that expertise might end up seeing it and might be confused. So who you're making the map for does make a difference. But other than that, I actually think that this is a pretty well done map. For a global perspective, I like that they give you a lot of information about where they got their data. So this right here is their data resources. Typically, you can tell that it's a pretty decently well thought through map if they actually have data sources listed, and it's also something that you can actually go check out. So if you're not sure that the data they have is legit, having data resources can actually tell you somewhere where you can go check. And I also like that they do have just basic symbology for things that are considered basically political boundaries or even just non-hazard related things. So the more reference-based items. So like where cities are or political boundaries for counties or countries. Just having that information there is helpful to the reader because most of the time when people look at maps, they actually look at places they already know And that's how they try and spatially reference what's going on in the map. So if we scroll up, most of us, I'm sure, are familiar with the US. If we scroll up here, you can actually look into the area of Idaho, and it's right there, Salt Lake City, so Boise's not that far above. That's where our eyes would probably go first because that's the area we're familiar with. So having reference maps that actually help you find areas that, or reference elements that help you find areas you're already familiar with, helps make map reading a little easier on the reader. So overall, I'm pretty happy with this map, and I think it's actually really cool. So now we're going to go to, we're not going to do that one. We are going to go to one of the National Geographic maps. Let's do this one. This one looks fun. So I'm going to see if this one will actually, nope. Sometimes I get lucky and sometimes I don't. View image. Here we go. So this one's pretty interesting because this isn't a global map and it's not necessarily a reference map in terms of how to get from one place to another road-wise. But this actually shows you a map of the Grand Canyon and things that have occurred when people have gone exploring. And you can actually see where first Grand Canyon landing was, and you can get a lot of history about exploration in this area from this map. So maps don't always have to be related to hazards or reference location or how to get from here to there, and they don't have to be related to census data or things like that. These things can be used for as much, almost anything. Like, I know a lot of people have taken GIS because of archaeology. They actually map out the sites they dig and will even map out where they find certain objects. So this is kind of one of those types of maps where they're not only giving you a spatial view of the Grand Canyon, they're also giving you historical references for specific places in that area. And it actually tells a story about how exploration there has influenced certain things. So when you guys are doing your chapter review questions for your Lab 5, that's the type of information I want to know. And if there's something about this map that you don't like you think there are too many text boxes, or it's really awesome that they wanted to give you this much information, but the way that they did it is overwhelming, that's what you're supposed to be doing. You want to critique these maps to say, this map had the purpose it needed, but it overdid it, or it didn't do enough in this respect. So that's what you guys' lab is going to be about. And if you guys have any questions about that, please let me know. But otherwise, I think you guys are pretty well set to get going on answering those questions. And then the lab itself for mastering the skills will actually have you go through the ArcGIS side of this and actually create a map for yourselves based on the tutorial. So that is the end of our demonstration / walkthrough for map critique. And if you guys have any questions, please let me know.